I still remember the sound of my mother's voice when she told me I was no longer her daughter, the way it cracked on the word disgrace, the way my father stood behind her with his arms crossed and his face turned to stone, and the way my younger sister Emma wouldn't even look at me as I packed my bags with shaking hands and tears streaming down my face. My name is Ellie Perry, I'm 28 years old, and this is about the day my family threw me away like garbage and the day they came crawling back. But before we go any further, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from all of you, and your support means everything to me. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March when I introduced them to Marcus, the man I loved more than anything in this world. We had been together for 2 years, and I was so excited for my family to finally meet him properly, not just in passing, but as the person who made me happier than I'd ever been. We drove from my apartment in Chicago to my parents' house in Naperville, a beautiful suburb with tree-lined streets and houses that all looked like they belonged in a magazine. Marcus held my hand the whole way and kept telling me it would be fine, that they would see how much we loved each other and nothing else would matter. I believed him because I was young and stupid, and I thought love conquered everything. The moment we walked through that front door, I should have known. My mother's smile froze on her face when she saw Marcus beside me. My father's handshake was cold and brief, and Emma disappeared upstairs without saying hello. Marcus was black, and my family was white and racist. Though they would never use that word to describe themselves, they were the kind of people who said things like, "I'm not racist, but," and "some of my coworkers are black," as if that proved anything. Dinner was torture. My mother barely spoke. My father asked Marcus questions that felt like interrogations about his job and his family and his intentions. And when Marcus excused himself to use the bathroom, my father leaned across the table and said, "Ellie, what are you thinking?" I told him I was thinking that I loved Marcus and that he was a good man, that he worked as a pediatric nurse and volunteered at a youth center on weekends and treated me better than anyone ever had. My mother put down her fork and said, "This is not the life we raised you for," and I felt my stomach drop because I knew what was coming. When Marcus came back, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. We left before dessert and I cried the entire drive home, while Marcus rubbed my back and told me to give them time. But there was no time that would fix this. 3 days later, my mother called and said I needed to make a choice, her or Marcus, family or this mistake I was making. I told her Marcus wasn't a mistake, that he was the person I was going to marry, that I couldn't believe she was making me choose between the man I loved and my own blood. She said, "Then you've made your choice," and hung up, just like that. 26 years of being their daughter erased in a single phone call. My father sent an email the next day, formal and cold like a business letter, saying that I was no longer welcome in their home and that they would not be supporting me financially or emotionally as long as I continued this relationship. I had already been living on my own and paying my own bills, but the words still cut deep. The idea that I could be disowned so easily, that their love was conditional on me living the life they wanted instead of the life that made me happy. Emma sent a single text that said, "You're breaking Mom's heart," and then blocked my number. The next 3 years were the hardest and best of my life, all at once. Marcus and I got married in a small ceremony at the courthouse with his family, surrounding us with love and acceptance. His mother held me while I cried and told me I was her daughter now, that their family was my family. I threw myself into my career as a physical therapist, working long hours at a rehabilitation center, and building a reputation for being good at what I did. Marcus picked up extra shifts, and we saved every penny we could. We bought a small house in a neighborhood that was just starting to turn around, nothing fancy, but it was ours. We painted the walls ourselves and planted flowers in the front yard, and made love in every room just because we could. I thought about my parents every single day, wondered if they thought about me, wondered if they regretted what they'd done, wondered if they drove past my old high school or saw my favorite cereal at the grocery store and felt even a flicker of loss. But I didn't reach out because my pride wouldn't let me, and because deep down I was still so angry. Angry that they chose hate over love. Angry that they didn't even try to know Marcus. Angry that I wasn't enough just as I was. Then last November, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. And I heard my mother's voice for the first time in 3 years. She said, "Ellie," and I could hear that she'd been crying. My whole body went rigid, and I sat down on the edge of the bed, because my legs suddenly felt weak. She said, "It's your father, he's sick." And then she told me about the pancreatic cancer, about the stage 4 diagnosis, about the medical bills that were piling up faster than they could handle. I should have felt sympathy. I should have felt that pull of family obligation, but all I felt was numb. I asked her why she was calling me after all this time, and she said, "Because you're still our daughter, because we need you." And I actually laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even me. I told her that I stopped being their daughter the day they told me to choose, that they made it very clear I wasn't family anymore. And she started crying harder and said, "Please, Ellie, we made a mistake. We were wrong." But she didn't say she was wrong about Marcus. Didn't say she was sorry for being racist. Didn't say she regretted throwing me away. She just said they needed help with the medical expenses and the mortgage because my father couldn't work anymore and their savings were disappearing. I asked about Emma, and my mother got quiet, then admitted that Emma had moved to California with her boyfriend and wasn't in a position to help, which was code for Emma had her own life and didn't want to deal with this mess. I told my mother I needed time to think, and I hung up. Then I sat in my bedroom and stared at the wall for an hour. Marcus found me there when he got home from his shift. I told him everything and waited for him to tell me what to do, but he just held my hand and said, "This is your choice, baby. Whatever you decide, I'm with you." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father sick and dying, about the man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my math homework and walked me down the aisle at my cousin's wedding. But then I thought about the man who stood silent while my mother called me a disgrace, who sent that cold email cutting me off, who chose his prejudice over his own child. My mother called again 2 days later, more desperate this time. She said the hospital was threatening to put a lien on their house, that they were behind on the mortgage, that my father was getting sicker, and the treatments were so expensive. She said, "You're doing well, aren't you? You always were so smart with money, so responsible." And I realized she'd been keeping tabs on me somehow, probably through mutual friends or distant relatives, probably knew about my career and my house, and assumed I had money to spare. I asked her how much they needed, and when she told me the number, I actually gasped. It was more than $50,000, more than I could possibly have saved. But then I thought about something. I thought about the inheritance from my grandmother who died when I was 23, the grandmother who left me $30,000 that my parents had managed as trustees until I turned 25, the money that my father had released to me right before the disowning with a note that said, "Here's your money, you'll need it since you won't have us." I had invested that money carefully, watched it grow, added to it when I could, and it was now sitting in an account worth close to $75,000, money I'd been saving for a down payment on a bigger house, or maybe for a baby someday. I told my mother I might be able to help, but I needed to see them first, needed to talk to my father myself, and she agreed so quickly I knew things must be really bad. That Sunday I drove to Naperville alone because Marcus said this was something I needed to do by myself, that he would be waiting for me when I got home, no matter what happened. The house looked the same but smaller somehow. The paint was chipping and the garden my mother had always been so proud of was overgrown with weeds. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I could make myself walk to the door. Emma answered, and for a second we just stared at each other. She had cut her hair short and lost weight and looked tired. She said, "He's in the living room," without saying hello or asking how I'd been. My father was in a recliner by the window. He'd lost so much weight I barely recognized him. His skin was gray and his eyes were sunken, and when he saw me, he started to cry, actual tears running down his hollow cheeks. My mother hovered nearby, wringing her hands, and I stood in the doorway feeling like a stranger in the house where I grew up. My father said, "Ellie girl," in a voice that was barely a whisper, and held out his hand. I didn't take it. I stood there with my arms crossed and asked him if he remembered the last thing he said to me. He looked confused, so I reminded him that it was in that email about how I was no longer welcome, about how I had disappointed them, about how they couldn't support my choices. He closed his eyes and more tears leaked out, and he said, "I'm sorry," but it sounded automatic, like something he was supposed to say, not something he meant. I looked at my mother and asked her point blank if she was sorry for what she said about Marcus, if she regretted calling my relationship a mistake, if she understood that her racism had destroyed our family. She looked uncomfortable and glanced at my father and said, "We were just trying to protect you. We wanted what was best for you." and I felt that familiar anger rise up in my chest. I told her that Marcus was what was best for me, that he was kind and loving and treated me like I mattered, that he was more family to me now than they had ever been. Emma spoke up then and said, "This isn't the time for this, Johan. Dad is dying and you're being selfish." And I turned on her so fast she actually stepped back. I told her she had no right to talk about selfish, when she'd abandoned me 3 years ago without even trying to understand, when she'd blocked my number and run away to California and left me to deal with the pain alone. She said, "You chose some guy over your family," and I said, "No, they chose racism over their daughter. There's a difference." The room went silent except for the sound of my father's labored breathing and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. My mother finally said, "What do you want from us, Ellie?" And I realized that was the question. What did I want? I wanted them to have suffered the way I suffered. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be thrown away. I wanted them to understand that love shouldn't come with conditions, and that you can't just take back 3 years of silence with a phone call when you need something. I told them I would help with the medical bills, but there would be conditions. My mother's face lit up with relief, but I held up my hand to stop her from speaking. I said first they would have to meet Marcus properly, sit down with him and have a real conversation, and apologize for how they treated him. I said second, they would have to go to therapy, family therapy, to deal with their prejudices and their conditional love. And I said third, they would have to understand that this money came from me choosing to help, not from them deserving it after how they treated me. My father nodded weakly and said anything, but my mother looked less certain. She asked how much I could give them, and I told her I could cover about $40,000, but it would take almost everything I had saved, that it would set me and Marcus back years in our plans, that it was a genuine sacrifice. She asked where the other $10,000 would come from, and I said that was their problem to figure out. Maybe they could take out a loan or ask their other daughter or sell some of the things they'd accumulated over the years. I watched her face fall and felt a grim satisfaction. But then I thought about it more. I thought about giving them that money and watching them take it without really changing, without really learning anything, without really understanding what they'd done to me, and something shifted inside me. I looked at my father dying in that chair, and my mother desperate beside him, and my sister glaring at me from across the room. And I realized that helping them wouldn't heal anything. It would just teach them that they could treat me terribly, and I would still come running when they needed me. So I changed my mind right there in that living room that smelled like sickness and regret. I told them I couldn't give them the money, that I had thought about it and realized that enabling them would just allow them to continue believing their love could be conditional, that they could pick and choose when I was their daughter based on whether I lived the life they approved of. My mother made a sound like I'd slapped her, and my father said please in a broken voice, and Emma called me a heartless bitch. I told them that if they had come to me 3 years ago and apologized, if they had reached out when they weren't desperate and dying, if they had made any effort to repair what they broke, then maybe things would be different, but coming to me only when they needed money proved that they didn't actually want me back. They just wanted what I could give them. I said that Marcus's family had welcomed me with open arms and no conditions, that they loved me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be, and that was the kind of family I deserved. My mother started yelling then, saying I was cruel and vindictive, and that I would regret this for the rest of my life, saying that when my father died it would be on my conscience, saying that I had turned into someone she didn't recognize. I told her that the person I'd turned into was someone who knew her worth, someone who wouldn't accept conditional love, someone who had learned that blood doesn't make you family, loyalty and respect do, and they had shown me neither. I walked out of that house and got in my car and drove away while my mother screamed after me from the porch. I could see her in the rearview mirror getting smaller and smaller until I turned the corner and she disappeared. I didn't cry until I was halfway home, and then I had to pull over because I was shaking so hard I couldn't see the road. Marcus met me at the door and held me while I sobbed into his chest. He didn't ask what happened. He just held me until I could breathe again. My father died 6 weeks later. I heard about it through a cousin who sent me a Facebook message with the funeral details. I didn't go because I knew I wouldn't be welcome, and because I had already said my goodbye in that living room when I chose myself over their expectations. My mother sent me a letter a month after that, full of anger and accusations, saying I had blood on my hands and that she hoped I was happy with my choices. I read it once and then burned it in the fireplace while Marcus watched. Here's what I learned. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally will love you the least. Sometimes protecting yourself means letting people face the consequences of their actions, even when those consequences are terrible. And sometimes the family you choose is worth more than the family you're born into. My parents taught me that their love came with a price tag and conditions and fine print. And when I didn't meet their requirements, they discarded me without a second thought. So when they needed me most, I gave them exactly what they gave me, nothing. I still have that money sitting in my account. Marcus and I are looking at bigger houses now and talking about starting a family. His mother has already started knitting baby blankets just in case. And I feel no guilt about the choice I made because guilt requires regret, and I have none. They disowned me when I needed their support, and I let them drown when they needed mine. And if that makes me cruel, then so be it. At least I'm cruel to people who earned it, not to someone whose only crime was falling in love with the wrong person in their eyes. And that's a lesson they learned far too late.